This is American Real. I am Roger Brooks. Welcome to the show.
This is American Real TV.
What's your mission? What do you want your legacy to be? You have such a great story. I cannot wait to share it. Welcome to the American Real family. I cannot wait to air this episode.
And now, here's your host, Roger Brooks.
Today, we're talking about the story behind the words, how America's founding ideas were formed, debated, sharpened, and ultimately expressed in the Declaration. Most of us learned a simplified version, a single moment, a single document, and a few famous names. But history is hardly that clean. In this conversation, we're going to dig into what was written before the Declaration, what unalienable rights really meant in its original forming, and how certain myths became common knowledge over time. We'll also look at the overlooked contributors across class, race, and gender, whose influence and sacrifice shaped the era, even if their names didn't make it into the textbooks. Joining me today is Charles Castleberry, historian, author, and constitutional researcher whose work focuses on America's founding era and the ideas that shaped the Declaration of Independence. He's the author of The Declaration's Forgotten Liberties, a book that uncovers overlooked documents, people, and principles that directly influenced Thomas Jefferson's pen, challenging long-standing myths while restoring historical context often missing from modern education. Charles, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
First off, just give us a little background, about your upbringing. How did you get interested in all this history and so specifically to the Declaration?
Well, sometimes you got to be hit on the head really, really hard to do what you need to do. I was raised in Oregon, and in 1972, I was a lumberjack between school. And a tree that was supposed to go down the mountain that somebody else fell came sideways. I was crossing a ravine, had a hard hat on, which saved my life. And the guy yelled, and I jumped, and the Douglas fir hit me on top of the head and shot me to the bottom of the ravine, almost killed me. And so later, I'm in my journalism classes at BYU, and sometimes I would have to leave the room in so much pain, and other times fall on the floor in the fetal position for 10 minutes. Really embarrassing. My heart even stopped because of the injuries, many times. And my in-laws came out from Bucks County, Pennsylvania at Christmas, and they saw how badly I was doing and said, "You just need to heal." So we moved, my wife and I and our young son. And my dad was talking to me on the phone from Oregon. He said, "Our ancestors lived right by where you are in Germantown, Pennsylvania in the 1680s. Oh, our first immigrant grandmother from Germany attended the very first protest against slavery." And then he said, somewhere in Pennsylvania are two old stone homes, Castleberry homes. From the 1700s, these stone homes. Do you know where they are? He'd never been to Pennsylvania. All I know is they're somewhere near a town with the word college in it. So I said, State College? I'd heard of Penn State. He said, "Yeah, probably." Well, that was nowhere near. It wasn't even built for another 150 years or so, but I didn't know that. About a year later, I had an appointment in a town called Collegeville. Didn't think anything of it until I'm a mile out of town. Flash. I wonder if it might have been Collegeville. A yellow flashing light by an old 1700 cemetery. I turned left with that thought. Went around a corner, cemetery, a barn. Another corner, I stopped and walked up to a house, and on the door knocker, Castleberry House. I about died. These people had bought it from the last Castleberry in 72, and this is about 79 now, 1979. They had restored the home. They had an antique shop in the shop behind the house. Then they took me to the barn, an incredible barn. John Castleberry's barn, and that was scratched in mortar in 1831, built by Mennonites and Amish, because they were Mennonites, these first. And then they took me to the adjacent house, the Derrick Castleberry house. This first one was the Anne E. Castleberry house. Derrick Castleberry house was Washington's headquarters, September 20th, 1777. And the story is that there was it was an architectural firm in there at that time, this beautiful, iconic home, stone home. As the Mr. Castleberry sent his wife and daughters about 20 miles away in a wagon, and he and his son stayed in the barn. And the story is that son's looking through the cracks of that barn, the boards. Washington's beautiful charger is there in their corral, and he's just thrilled. So my dad came out to visit, and my mom from Oregon, and we took them there, and it was just amazing. Dad's a surveyor, he was, and we found some of the original properties that our initial ancestor had, Heinrich Kesselberg from Germany. So when he was, anglicized name, Henry Castleberry. So we moved out to Utah a few years later, and then about 35 years later, we visited Philadelphia again. And I said, "Do you mind if we drive up and see if that house is still standing for sale by auction?" Oh no. Mrs. Granoff had died. It had been empty for a couple of years. Their son had moved up to lower upstate New York, a physician. And so it was terrible, horrible condition, but it's still a beautiful property. And so I called up the auctioneer after we got back to Utah. I said, "Why don't you not hold the auction?" So, "Why? Are you going to make an offer?" I said, "Yeah, well, I better ask my wife first." Because all of the zone was called Village Commercial, and all the interest was to tear it down and replace it with some commercial buildings. Beautiful tree-lined properties, the barn and all of that. So we did it, and we didn't know why. And it took 5 years. I began being bombarded by history. Right across the fence, the wall into the cemetery, Tomb of Unknown Soldiers, big mound. 150 soldiers are buried there because after the Battle of Germantown, as Washington took the troops into Valley Forge for the winter 6 miles away, there was a hospital at this old church. 150 unknown soldiers buried there.
Wow.
Large plaque by the DAR commemorating that. A few stones away is a grave of Captain Vaushall Howard of the Maryland Light Dragoons. Washington rode up as president from Philadelphia to visit. It's the only time we can find that he visited his fallen comrades. He removed his hat and said, "This is the grave of a brave man, a very brave man. I knew him well." The locals say that he stayed in that first house, Anne E. Castleberry house, that we restored that night. Now, the night that they were there on September 20th, 1777, that is the night of the Paoli Massacre. And that's a whole discussion. But so they held a council of war that next morning there at what's called the Glebe House, which is the parsonage. It's now an Episcopal church. That was the Church of England, of course, at the time. And then as we began restoring the house, I found the 1688 petition against slavery that I had never heard about. The Germantown Petition Against Slavery. It's an incredible document, and I've got a copy of that in my book. Our grandmother was there, but on that petition, which says these blacks have as much right to fight for their freedom as you do to keep them in bondage. Why would they be doing this in Pennsylvania? Quakers live there. 50% of the British Quakers in 1688 owned slaves. 70% of the Quaker leadership owned slaves. William Penn did as well and wrote that he preferred having slaves as to indentured servants. Even though they're both slaves during term of that indenture, he didn't lose his investment in the slaves as he did with those who reached the end of their indenture. You're buying stolen property. It's against the golden rule, but they wrote it much better. What if the slaves band together and fight for their freedom? Are you going to take up the sword and put them back into slavery? Well, you know what? You can't. They didn't say this. You're Quakers. You don't believe in violence. And these men stood against it. But it wasn't passed. They said it's too weighty of a matter. So they sent it to Philadelphia to the quarterly meeting. Too weighty a matter. So they sent it to New Jersey, to the yearly meeting, the Quaker meeting. Nope. And then they sent it to England, hoping that King and Parliament could ban slavery. It was 1688, 1689. That's the time of the Glorious Revolution when King James had disbanded Parliament. Uh, and then he was removed from power, and William and Mary came into power. And so nothing happened. But I'm so proud that my grandmother was there. Then when I read the document, there's a name, Abraham Optengraf, with Daniel Pastorius and Optengraf's brother and another Garrett Carver. Who's Abraham Optengraf? I don't know why I was interested. So I did some research. His daughter owned our farm. Her daughter married Paul Castleberry. Abraham Optengraf lived on that farm in his later years. John Greenleaf Whittier wrote about a 40-page poem, and it's printed. I have an original, The Pennsylvania Pilgrim. It's about the 1688 petition against slavery. And he talks about old man Optengraf stoking the backlog of the fire as he's thinking about his life in the old country. And as the embers rise, they illuminate his face, half austere, half serene. Whittier's writing about this, and nobody knows about this. I found out words. So we're related to the first salvo against slavery from two angles. It's at Haverford College. It was lost for 100 years and found, and they've got it in their library, in a safe, in the basement, and nobody can see it. They brought it out. I have a photo of me holding that document, 1688. That spurred me, in addition to some things that Father Mike Sowards of the St. James Episcopal Church did for me as well. He had people bring me all the records of the cemetery, things you can't see because they're weathered from 1700s, early 1700s. I have it all. So when my parents came out, I took them to that cemetery, to the homes, and my little 5-year-old son was with us, and our baby, we're looking and we're finding Castleberries in the graveyard. Maybe that's why I turned at that light. Turn, bones creaking, whatever. Why would you turn and walk up to a door? I didn't know why I walked at that door. But anyway, my son, 5-year-old David, where's Jacob's grave? Who's Jacob? Jacob Castleberry, where is his grave? What? Why? I had a dream about him. He's buried here. We found Jacob's grave. It's Jacob Rush Castleberry. Stephen Rush had an inn next door. There were 4 Castleberry homes built, stone homes built on this farm. He was next door to the upper 2. And then he had the Stephen Rush Inn. He's related to Dr. Benjamin Rush. 20 years later, David married Natalie Rush here in Utah. I don't know why, but there are things that were driving these. And then I see what's called a pew chart that they gave me from the church from 1790. Parishioners rented the pews that they sat in at that time as families and groups. In it, it showed who rented them, how many in that family or group were men, boys, women, other free, and slaves. And a whole bunch of them owned slaves. This was 1790. That's 10 years after Pennsylvania had outlawed slavery, the first state to outlaw it. Now, Massachusetts was the first state to have no slaves, but Pennsylvania outlawed it first. So I had to start doing research, and that's what started me on the quest. Because there were still slaves, over 4,000 at that time, still a lot in 1810 census, all the way up to the 1840 census. There were 30,000 slaves in New York early, and then it's still 30,000 slaves in 1810 in New York. I think it was New York. But there were 40,000 slaves initially in the North when the Constitution was signed. 650 some thousand in the South, but 40,000 in the North.
So what do you make of that? Why? How?
It goes to the Constitution. We cannot take property away from people. None of their children would be slaves from then on. But if a slaveholder is holding them, can't be taken away. That's why the Emancipation Proclamation is so badly misinterpreted and understood. That document freed no slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation. Of course, we had Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware that did not secede, but they all had slaves. Also, Tennessee was controlled by the Union at that time. So the Emancipation Proclamation took those out of it as well, because he could not take constitutionally slaves away. Then 48 counties in Northwest Virginia were controlled by the Union also at that time. They were explicitly excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation as well. Also down by Norfolk and a whole bunch of parishes in Louisiana, all written in the Emancipation Proclamation as being excluded, as if it hadn't been written. Here's 800,000 slaves not freed. Why? You're the Union. Because we have to have a constitutional amendment so we can do that. And we have to warn all these other states that are still doing it, that if you come back in the Union, you come back and you have to free your slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation was the promise of freedom only if we won the war. And so it did. And Jefferson or Lincoln actually saw a bunch of the states. The 21st state to ratify the Emancipation Proclamation, or the 13th Amendment, excuse me, was Arkansas on April 14th, 1865, the day he was shot. Mm-hmm. And then a few more were needed to get to 28. The last one to ratify was Georgia on December 6th, 1865. And then it was made part of the Constitution by Secretary Seward on December 18th, 1865. That's what freed the slaves, not the Emancipation Proclamation. The Constitution worked. After 210,000 blacks fought in the Union, and almost there were about 67,000 casualties among the blacks, 26 Medal of Honor winners, heroes that we need to celebrate. So all this story started becoming together for me. And then I started doing research, and it's in the book, and on slavery. And people don't want to learn about the Constitution, and they teach their kids to hate the Constitution and the Declaration because they didn't address slavery enough. And then we look at charts like this that I've put together. I've put pictures to words of slavevoyages.org, and we see that 5 million of the slaves that came across from Africa came from Portugal to Brazil. England, 2.3 million to the Caribbean. England, 301,000 to America, North America. 388,000 slaves came here under our flag when we became finally a nation and can finally do something about it. 63,927 came here out of 10.5 million, 0.06%. All of it was bad. We should never say, oh, some people were benevolent slave masters. No, it was all wrong. But it was all wrong around the world, and we were the very least of the offenders, believe it or not. And up to the Civil War, there were 4 million slaves, and we lost 1.5 million people. 750,000 deaths. It's been updated now. 1.5 million casualties to free them. That's blood and treasure that we fought for. Now, another thing that's interesting is the whole world, and I've got this in the book, believes that England banned slavery first before we did. Well, England in 1807, they say that they banned slavery. And people who know mean that they banned participation in the slave trade from Africa, bringing them over. So remember, they brought 2.6 million. That's a lot. And so on March 25th, 1807, England passed legislation to ban participation in the slave trade. Well, what's interesting, on December 2nd, 1806, Jefferson sent a State of the Union letter to Congress congratulating them that they were going to be that body that would remove us from participation in the slave trade. And he repeated things that he had in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, the slavery clause. So our Congress passed the legislation March 2nd, 1807, banning participation in the slave trade. Now, people say, well, that didn't free them. No, but Jefferson wrote in 1774, in what's called a Summary View of the Rights of British America, we'll talk about in a minute, he said, the abolition of domestic slavery is the great desire of those colonies where it was unhappily introduced in our infant state. He said, but before general manumission, we have to stop the importation of slaves. But the king has prostituted his negative on all of our legislative attempts to restrain or ban this execrable commerce. I have a document in the book that shows how the king sold for 100,000 pounds a bond to a group of men in Virginia for the right to collect duties on liquor and slaves. That was to be paid to the heir, to the king, his heirs, or successors. He was profiting from the slave trade. We know of at least 7 times that our legislatures tried to ban the importation of slaves. And he vetoed every one of them, or his governor did in his name. And the document that I have, a friend of mine has found in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. The owner had no idea of its value. It proves that the king prostituted his negative. That means he sold for illicit reasons his veto on our efforts. That's what's the language of the slavery clause in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. And I have to admit, that is what began to spur me on to writing this book. The rough draft I lectured on for about 3 hours, for 3 days to thousands of people in St. George, Utah. This is the initial draft of the Declaration of Independence. This Christian king of Great Britain determined to keep open a market where men, and he wrote great big, MEN, should be bought and sold. And it goes on. It's the largest clause by far, and Congress deleted it in the last deliberations because Georgia and South Carolina wouldn't sign the declaration unless that was removed. 11 states said yes. They would have done away with slavery with the inception of our new nation, had that worked. Now, what had Jefferson done just before the Declaration? Do you mind that I'm rambling? You might have questions.
Please,
Okay.
no. Everyone's going to be as interested as I am.
Well, we have a succession of Jefferson's writings. So the first one was in 1774, called the Summary View of the Rights of British America. And I have this all through my book because it's virtually long paragraphs about every single grievance in the Declaration of Independence, plus the information for the preamble. The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. The hand of force may destroy, but cannot disjoin them. That means life and liberty cannot be disjoined. He changed that to say they are inalienable, life and liberty. They can only be disjoined by force. And so he wrote inalienable, but the printer seemed to have changed it to unalienable. And people have trouble explaining what inalienable means. They think it means it's just something that is going to happen or that was inevitable. No, they can't be disjoined. Life and liberty, they're separated. They came from God, and he said that. And what's interesting is another reason for this is the whole world, all of academia, all of government, says that Jefferson borrowed 3 principles for the Declaration of Independence preamble about life and liberty, pursuit of happiness, that when the government gets his authority from the people, that's the John Locke principle, and that when the governments become corrupt, it's our duty to to abolish and replace them. Those three things he wrote 2 years before in that document that I read in here by Barnes and Noble. When I read the summary view of the rights of British America, it was a 29-page pamphlet. He wrote it it wasn't a pamphlet, he wrote it for the first delegates, the Virginia delegates to the First Continental Congress in summer of 1774. It is the entire Declaration of Independence writ large, whole paragraphs explaining a single sentence of each grievance. For example, he controls our trade, it says, right? We can only trade with England. Well, he goes on to explain that we can only trade with Great Britain. We didn't used to. They passed laws that said we couldn't, and they doubled and trebled the prices for what they charge us, and we get less valuable commodities that we can get at more convenient ports. So we're getting less valuable goods, doubling, triple the price because they set the prices that they will pay us for our tobacco, for example. And they won't let us sell what they don't use for their own consumption. They take it all and resell to the rest of the world, making the profits on our labor. And that's why they were talking about they were being treated as slaves. The Iron Act. We can dig iron up and we can make pig iron, but we have to send it to England. And he says that we have to pay for commission, freight, and insurance there so that it benefits machines and not men, he said. And then we have to pay the same for everything, the finished goods coming back. We can trap beaver on our own property, for example, he says, but we can't make hats out of them because of the Hat Act. We have to send the beaver pelts to England or there would be mad hatters in England and we would be fined and put in jail if we make hats and try to sell any beaver hats. And beaver hats weren't just for military. They, or even the top hats. They were really big items. So he wrote that document. And then a year later, in 1775, summer of 75, July, he wrote the rough draft of what's called the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. It was like a Declaration of Independence almost. It filled in two really important areas that he hadn't written yet in the summary view of British America because some of those things hadn't happened, the Quebec Act and some others. So we can get into those later, but it's all in the book. The king, after the French and Indian War, drew what's called the Proclamation Line, said we can't go past the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. We have to stay on the eastern seaboard. Our charters went all the way to the Mississippi, and a couple of them went to the South Sea. All of our colonial charters, by law, went to the Mississippi River or the South Sea. Pennsylvania didn't go that far. It went to 5 degrees west of the Ohio River. But Pennsylvania's charter went up to almost Buffalo, New York. Wow. And down to about Newcastle, Delaware. And that overlapped Maryland's claim, a charter from the king, which had come about 29 to 80, 40 years earlier or whatever. There was a conflict between around Newcastle up to kind of Villanova area in Pennsylvania, so above Philly a little bit. There was even a war in the 1730s called Cresap's War. And when Thomas Cresap finally got arrested and taken to Philadelphia in chains in the back of a wagon, he stood and said, Philadelphia is the most beautiful city in all of Maryland. That was their claim prior to Pennsylvania's, So there was conflict. And then the heroes came over from England to settle that conflict, finally in the early 1860s, and that was Mason and Dixon. We can't say Dixon or Dixie today. They settled this conflict. Mason and Dixon, they were astronomers and a surveyor from England. They had been sent by the Royal Society of London to Sumatra to measure the transit of Venus across the sun. And there were other teams in Norway and other places around the world. They didn't make it to Sumatra. They were attacked by the French as they left England, and they went back to Liverpool or wherever with cannonballs in their hull. They finally made it to South Africa. They triangulated the findings from around the world and determined the distance of the Earth from the sun and the size of the sun, and also Venus as well. These men were brought because they had to go across between Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania through the wilderness, shoot the sun, shoot the stars, and they did the Mason-Dixon line to settle a dispute. All states, all colonies were slave colonies at the time. It had nothing to do with slavery. And 99.9% of the people in the world think that it had to do with slavery. Then afterward, Dixon was again assigned by the Royal Society to determine the distance between the latitudes on the Earth. His findings were 99.9 something percent accurate to today's satellite technology. And we can't say his name anymore. So there's just so much that as we get into history, it gets a little bit, mixed up.
And why don't we know the facts? Like, why do the facts get changed or misconstrued? Like, in your opinion, what happens for that to miss the history books because it's just a shame that a lot of this we don't know, or we don't know the actual facts as they really were.
It's interesting, and I've been wondering about that just this last week. I asked me that. Some of it has to do with the winners, who writes the story. So we get to, let's just use this as an example. We get to the Declaration and the Constitution. We've got things going on with Federalists and Anti-Federalists, people who want a stronger, government, federal government, and those that don't. Jefferson was on the Anti-Federalist side, along with George Mason, Patrick Henry, and for example, Jefferson and Adams had been great friends earlier, and then after they both ran for the presidency, the Federalists, Hamilton and Madison and some of these others. They're the one, and Adams, their stories are the ones that won. So, for example, everybody believes that Thomas Jefferson borrowed from George Mason the text in three sections for the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, because his Virginia Declaration of Rights has three things that sound quite a bit like the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. And so people have assumed that he had done that and borrowed from Mason. That document got to Philadelphia and was printed in the paper on June 12th, 1776. And so Jefferson and the committee were assigned on June 11th. So people assumed that he saw that newspaper article and thought, oh, I know what I'm going to write for our declaration now. He wrote it all 2 years earlier. He had all of those already done. But it's convenient and it's a cool story. Now, the other one is that everybody seems to believe, I hate to say it, but even Mark Levin, I saw on Fox News, that John Adams and Jefferson spent 2 weeks at the tavern, the city tavern, and in their lodgings on High Street. Jefferson's lodging was on High Street at the time. That's Walnut today. Writing from preamble to conclusion, he says. The Declaration, they struggled, and that's not true. That wasn't invented until the 1800s. Original source documents show that Thomas Jefferson had already written all of it before, because when he got to Philadelphia for the second session of the Second Continental Congress on about May 14th, he learned that Adams had just sent a letter out to all of the colonies. You need to write your own constitutions. He wanted to go back to Williamsburg because his heart was in Virginia, but he couldn't because he was committed. So this was the second session of the Second Continental Congress. He had been there all through 75, and he wrote that other document that I said that was very critical, and he used some of that for the Declaration as well. And so he wrote a proposed constitution at his lodgings. We call it the Declaration House today. It's the Graph House, and I've been in that room. You can't get there today. It's under construction. It's going to be for a long time, but it's a very important room. He wrote in seclusion a proposed constitution for Virginia. And on June 12th, he sent it to Virginia with George Wythe, his partner and mentor, the attorney. It got to Virginia, to Williamsburg, too late. The convention had already accepted George Mason's constitution, but it didn't have a good introduction. So what did they do? They took Jefferson's introduction to his proposed constitution and appended it to that. And so that became the preamble to the Virginia Constitution of June 1776. And you can read that today. Most people think that the Virginia Declaration of Rights was a preamble to the Virginia Constitution. It wasn't. It was a separate guiding document, but not a part of the Constitution. Jefferson's preamble was. And guess what that preamble was that he had? It was all of the grievances that he later wrote into the Declaration of Independence. A copy of that, I call it the composition draft, was at his elbow as he wrote the first draft, the rough draft of the Declaration of Independence. But what's interesting in this, like number 10, next to it, he wrote number 16. It's number 10 in the Virginia Constitution, but in the Declaration of Independence, he moved it down. So you see the 16 got moved. Next to number 11, he wrote 13. And so 13 got moved down to where it's bracketed right down here. It's hard to see, of course. So he appended it and moved it down. And then as he wrote what he had in the Virginia Constitution preamble, the king, he is inciting insurrections amongst our fellow subjects. And he wrote that in the Philadelphia draft of his rough draft of the Declaration. While the ink was wet, he wiped out the word subjects, and over the top of it, he wrote citizens.
Wow.
Locke, nobody had ever used the word citizens before. He realized in the moment, because the ink was wet, that's a proof. No, we're not subjects to the king, no more. We're citizens. That's a new people, a new social contract in the moment. And what did he do? In his composition draft, he scratched through the word subjects, and above it, he wrote citizens. So we proved that this followed that. If he would have changed it in his composition draft, he would not have written subjects.
Right. Wow.
This is what he had at his hand, and nobody knows it. It is mentioned in this, the writings of Thomas Jefferson in 1950 by Julian Boyd, Princeton University Press. But almost as an aside, this is very important because it corrects the record. And I didn't know if I wanted to fight this because every government website, all of academia, teach the other stories. They don't go back to original source. They go back to a convenient source. It's a convenient, interesting story. And I don't want to degrade Mason because his Virginia Declaration of Rights and his Constitution, very, very important things. All of the other colonies, almost all of them, included some of his Virginia Declaration of Rights in their constitutions. Mm-hmm. But Virginia hadn't. It was separate. Wikipedia says that it got made part of the Virginia Constitution in 1830. That's incorrect. It was not appended, but put together with it as a guiding document as it was restored originally. It wasn't until 1868, according to the Library of Virginia, that it was officially appended and became the Bill of Rights for the Virginia Constitution. So George Mason attended the Constitutional Convention, didn't he? He rose about 136 times to address the convention, one of the top 5 who gave input. He wanted a Declaration of Rights, a Bill of Rights made part of the Constitution. Madison thought that was too limiting. No, if we write it, that means what about all those other rights? No, he would not allow it. And he said finally, I would rather cut off my right hand than sign it as it is. He wrote 16 reasons why. It was that one. He didn't want to wait 20 years to ban the importation of slaves either. Now, um, he fought against it. And so he has been written out of history. George Mason's Virginia Constitution, I believe, was a Virginia plan, the structure of the Virginia plan that Madison presented. Madison is now called the father of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights because Virginia, New York, Massachusetts especially, they wouldn't sign it in the ratifying conventions, the Constitution. But Madison finally said, we'll put them in. And so in 1791, he sent 12 proposed amendments for the states to ratify. They ratified 10. That's the 10 amendments. Guess what? Every one of those 10 came from those Virginia documents. 9 from George Mason and 1 from Thomas Jefferson's preamble. It was already written. George Mason is the father of the Bill of Rights. I believe he's the father of the Constitution. None of these men claimed originality. They went back to Cicero. All of these men were learned on Cicero and Locke and these others. But Jefferson had a succession of writings that prove where he wiped out the word citizens. There's what was underneath there?
Subjects.
2010.
Yeah.
Subjects.
Wow.
A librarian at the Library of Congress noticed a smudge under the word citizens, right? See which hand? Right there. There's a smudge. What's under that? She used hyperspectral imaging and started to bring out what was underneath that. Subjects was underneath citizens.
Wow.
2010. So these are little things, but it tells a story to answer your question.
Yeah.
Why? Now, when I lecture, people say, why don't our kids know this? And it surprised me because liberal and conservatives, when I talk at, say, the Mayflower Society or other places, why don't we know this?
Yeah.
I don't have a good answer. So we went to DC. I wanted to see if I wanted to fight this. And we drove over to the Jefferson Memorial. It was closed. We couldn't get in. And my wife, as we started to drive away, right across the street, there's the Mason Memorial, George Mason. So I stopped and I went in and it said that George Mason inspired Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence through his Virginia Declaration of Rights. And that's on every website. And I sat on a bench where he is sitting as a statue. And I realized there's more to tell. He needs to be elevated for what he did instead of being misremembered about what he didn't do. He did. He borrowed from Jefferson, not the other way around. And so I spoke with the director of education at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, a lead expert historian at Monticello, the lead Jefferson man at Independence Hall and others. The guy at Independence at the National Constitution Center was amazed because they had never heard these. They're original source documents, and I don't understand it.
Unbelievable. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. If you've been sitting on a manuscript, this is your sign. American Real Publishing turns your book idea into a real professional release. Expert editing, beautiful cover design, print and ebook distribution, and a launch plan that builds momentum, while you retain 100% of your rights and royalties. We've helped hundreds of authors, like Charles Castleberry, bring their books to market. So, if you're ready to move from draft to distributed, visit AmericanRealPublishing.com and schedule a book publishing game plan call. All right, so welcome back. And Charles, I'd love if you could start with showing us or telling us how you came across that very unique Jefferson document.
Well, I knew I had read about it somewhere before. But so I went online. I used Google. I used every question I could ask of Google to try to find the document. No, it kept coming up with other documents. And what's interesting about search engines is they're filtered. A lot of things that we find are the things that are kind of bought to be, by Google or buy from Google to come up first. And then I went to ChatGPT. I used everything and it could not find it. And it thought that I was using my imagination to make up this document. Then I remembered I had purchased a few years ago a 1950, so it's a 76-year-old book, The Papers of Thomas Jefferson, Princeton University Press, John Boyd. So it is by Julian P. Boyd. So the papers, version one of Thomas Jefferson, 1760 to 1766. So I started thumbing through, went near the Declaration, and that covered a lot. And then I found the document, and he calls it the Jefferson's first ideas on the Virginia Constitution. That's page one of his first draft. So this is a little different than what ended up in the Virginia Constitution, but this is what he had at his elbow as he's writing the Declaration of Independence. This is two-thirds of the Declaration already done.
And is that the same document
all of it
as you showed us earlier? The other document, is that the same document?
Yeah, that is this. Now, after I got this one, you can see this is black and white. Then after I got that, I used some key words and I found it buried at the Library of Congress on another site that we could not get to through normal searches. It just was not bringing it up. And so this is from the Library of Congress. And this is where Boyd got it for his 1950 book, showing where he scratched out the word subjects, wiped it out while the ink was wet on the Declaration, and then wrote citizens. And then he wrote citizens over the top on this, but he couldn't wipe it out because he'd already written that, 2-3 weeks earlier, who knows for sure. But so he had written the Declaration of Independence before he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And what's interesting is most people, I believe, don't consider the fact that Jefferson was really involved in the first session of the Second Continental Congress, 75. And that's where he wrote the Declaration for the Necessity of Taking Up Arms, the rough draft of that. Dickinson from Pennsylvania thought it was too radical, so his finished product is what went out to the king and everybody. But we still have Jefferson's rough draft, his fair copy of that. So that, the summary view, and then the Constitution for Virginia is a triad of writings over a 2-year period that have all of the Declaration written already. Even so much as enemies in war and in peace, friends in that 75 document. So I talked to the director of a university constitutional studies 2 days ago up at the Utah State Capitol. And he wondered, well, why are you making such a big deal of this? Other people wrote these same things. I said, Jefferson never claimed originality. He was trying to show the voice of what was understood. He said, well, Adams sent out a letter. He wrote some of these things. No, he didn't write the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was a violinist, and his words became music. I call them the Psalms of Liberty, like David's harp. Jefferson's violin, he tuned those words. Those are Jefferson's words. So I'm not trying to lionize Thomas Jefferson. I'm just following his writings. Sure. And they came to it. And I didn't approach it with that understanding. You have to approach history with questions. Always questions, and then question the answers until you get to the original source. So when we make assumptions, oh, here's a document. Jefferson's document sounds a whole lot like that. That makes sense. It's a convenient myth. I call them myth takes, MYTH, myth takes. Right. You have to have a lisp to say that right?
That's great.
Let me hear you say it.
Myth takes.
You got it. You got it well.
But let me ask you, so going back to what you were saying earlier before we broke, why are so many historians complacent? in this, right? I mean, if this document has been available, and I guess readily available through the Library of Congress, and you mentioned it's written on this monument. It's all over the place. But why? What's your take on that?
It started with the progressive movement in the teens and 20s. And then by 1949, it was the first time we know that it was really written about, that's about Mason and Jefferson, Jefferson borrowing from Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights to write the Declaration. So that wasn't long-standing, actually. So the last 75 years is really the biggest time that this has been understood, and nobody questions it. So, I think there's some great historians, Pauline Maier and Ray Raphael and some others. They prove it by showing what Mason wrote compared to what Jefferson wrote. But they don't go to the third column. What did Jefferson write 2 years prior?
Right.
I don't understand. And so it's been accepted. And some people think that I'm perhaps wanting to lionize Jefferson, and they don't want that to happen because he owned slaves, and because he had children with Sally Hemings. But Jefferson had been writing for all these years about the horrors of slavery, and blamed the king for not letting us stop it. And some people say, well, Jefferson didn't want more slaves to come in. That would make his slaves more valuable, supply and demand. But his writings disprove that. And I'll show some of that in the book as we flip through that in just a few minutes. And Jefferson had inherited his slaves from his father when he died, when Jefferson was quite young. And then when Mr. Wales died, his wife Martha's father, he inherited a quarter of the debt along with the slaves that they received from him. That was the largest number of slaves, and about over $1 million worth of debt. What was the collateral of the debt, for the debt? Slaves. So for the people who owned the debt, Jefferson's slaves that he had inherited was the collateral. If he were to free those slaves, where would they go? To satisfy the debt. Not free. So he felt like, he called it holding a wolf by the ears. You can't hold him and you can't safely let him go. And then Sally Hemings, do you know who she was? That people say that, okay, she was his sister-in-law, right?
Yeah.
So she was his wife's sister. Her mother, who was half white, was Martha Jefferson's father's mistress after his other wives had died, and they had children. So she's 3/4 white. And then I still thought always that this was essentially rape when a slave owner had children. But we can't know that, and we can't judge then with today's maybe the understandings that we have. And if you read the biography of a gentleman named John Roy Lynch, he was the first former slave that became a representative from Mississippi after the Civil War. And his father was Irish, and his mother was African. And she was supposedly just the most beautiful woman. And but she couldn't be freed by law. So they had kind of a common law marriage. And then after his father died, he had talked to his best friend, and to keep my wife and my children safe from slavery, he turned around and sold them back to their old owner, and they became slaves again. But he talked about the love between that father and that mother, and he talked about others that he knew that their fathers loved them and passed on their land to them. And I started to see something different, but they couldn't marry by law, and the stigmatism that would go with that. So a lot of it had to be kept hidden. I'm not going to judge it. That's for me. That's not for me to judge. I can only take his writings, and that's what I have to go with.
Right.
Okay.
Great. Would you like to share your screen and walk us through some of the book? Because I know that was something we were.
Yeah. One of the things we're going to take a look at is some heroes that aren't all white. Some of our heroes in our country were Native Americans. This represents the oldest constitution in the world, the Great Law of Peace, the Iroquois Confederacy or the Iroquois League, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca, how they came together. So we're going to show a little, when you see that in the book, that'll tell you a little bit about what it is. And this represents, the Native Americans know what this means. We don't very much, but we can find out a little bit. And I learned this from Yale University Press. Their Great Law of Peace is online. As a matter of fact, let me just tell you quickly, it came to Hiawatha from a stranger who had rowed a white stone canoe across the lake. I think Lake Onondaga, I'm not sure, up in the Finger Lakes area of New York.
Yes.
And he had received this great law of peace in a dream because all of these five nations were murdering each other. And he had received this dream to bring them together. So finally they did. And there's some great stories there too, I don't have time for. And then they buried their weapons of war beneath the great white pine tree. That leads us into maybe where we'll go as we share the screen and show you some of the book.
Excellent.
Okay, here's our little kids part. We'll show you that in a few minutes, but we'll go to the adult version of the book. And people have always asked, what got you interested in this? And it is the home that I think I told you about. And so let me come onto this screen here. So this was it's called the Anne E. Castleberry home.
Okay.
Had two front doors. The one on the left is where we have the old colonial kitchen. I'll show you in a minute. This was built in the mid 1750s. And then this section here there's a beautiful dining room and living room or bedroom above here. This was a 1795 edition. And then back in the back is the new edition from about the 1820s. That's what we see back here. Here's the colonial kitchen after we restored the home, and we left this kitchen like it was with the walk-in fireplace and those old doors and these original floorboards, this white pine.
Amazing.
Long boards. And here we see in the 1820s section, they still had boards, but they weren't as well done. There was actually better carpentry in the mid 1700s than this new edition. Here's the 1795 edition with the original millwork around the fireplace. And it's just thrilling. Here's our barn, this German stone bank barn, horse stalls with Dutch doors on them. Here's the house adjacent, the Derrick Castleberry house. So this whole estate was used by Washington and then later as a hospital after the Battle of Germantown, while Washington took the troops into Valley Forge for the winter. So this was the original section is the little section on the left of the Derrick Castleberry house from here over to the left. That was 1734. Oh, yeah, 1734. And then two more there. And then the mansard roof was put on around Civil War time. And then there is another section behind. So this was Washington's headquarters, September 20th, 1777, the night of the Paoli Massacre. And because of that, they have people from Valley Forge, their actors come over. And they reenacted President Washington visiting the grave of Captain Vachel Howard here at the St. James Episcopal Church, and Father Sowards, a very dear friend of mine here. So, and here is the Tomb of Unknown Soldiers, Revolutionary War, 150 unknown soldiers, this plaque placed by the Daughters of the American Revolution.
Amazing.
Now, many people are not aware that for a month, beginning May 27th, 1776, a group of 21 Iroquois leaders from 4 different tribes arrived in Philadelphia. And they stayed on the second floor of the Pennsylvania State House. We call it Independence Hall today, but it was the Pennsylvania
Okay.
State Hall House. And a couple of them stayed at Carpenter's Hall next door. So they were there through the entire time that Jefferson and others were working. Because on June 11th, the very day that Thomas Jefferson and the group of committee of five was asked to write the Declaration, they addressed Congress. And they said that they wanted to be brothers and friends as long as the sun shall shine and the waters run. And they gave John Hancock a new name, Curwandawan, meaning great tree. That's the very day that Jefferson began writing the Declaration of Independence. So they started it. And then, so about 1150 AD is when the Iroquois Confederacy came to be. And people have tabbed it to that because of an event that was a comet or something in the sky that had been that they memorialize and that can be tapped to there. So the Iroquois came to a meeting in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 1744, to meet with leaders from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. And their leader, Canasatego, wanted us to unite the way that they had united in their Iroquois League because of the threats of war from the French. So he wanted us 13 colonies to unite. And he took out an arrow and he showed how easily you could snap a single arrow. But then when he took out the bundle of six, he showed it's impossible to break that united bundle. That inspired Franklin, and look what's in the claw, the talon of the eagle. Peace and strength, but modified by the peace that we see here in the other talon. Now, the great law of peace, a lot of people believe it inspired our Constitution. Well, it may have to a degree just to unite, but there are no articles or sections in the Constitution that draw upon the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy. Leaders should serve the people, not rule over them. Decisions should be made by consensus. Peace is stronger than war. Future generations matter. They say that whatever we do affects our generations, our offspring and our generations to the seventh generation. Some people think that means they are in the middle, three generations before that affected us, who we are, and then us affecting three others or seven from us, whichever way you want, that's fine. But for example, with slavery, there are still people who have that pain, DNA deep. You don't just say, get over it, because we carry things from our ancestors, and the Native Americans knew that. The future generations matter. And then unity makes a strong nation. And another very important thing is that the women were highly cherished, not just for what they did, but for what they thought in decisions and consensus. So here is that, the same representation of the belt I showed you. And where they buried their weapons of war beneath the great tree of peace. So Thomas Jefferson told us that the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights are the creed of our political faith, the text of civic instruction. And he says that the principles, they form a bright constellation which has gone before us and guided our steps. And should we wander from them in moments of error or alarm, let us hasten to retrace our steps to regain the road which alone leads to peace and safety. That means we need to learn what the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration says. The trouble is, it's not taught. Mostly, they teach, don't you believe? They teach the preamble, right?
Yep.
We hold these truths. Everybody knows that. And often they'll have the kids read the grievances of the Declaration. Those are the long train of abuses. But every one of those tells a great story, and they're not being told. It's the history behind them that's important, not just a single sentence. So as we go through the book, Abraham Lincoln called the Declaration of Independence the golden apple in the silver frame of Constitution and Union. So I'm going to skip forward a little bit here. we get to where we hold these truths. Jefferson, 2 years before, in the summary view of the rights of British America, had written, "Upon those rights which God and the laws have given equally and independently to all, the God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. The hand of force may destroy, but cannot disjoin them. Life and liberty come from God, not a king." And then when we see the top part of the original, his rough draft, when he presented it after finishing it to Adams and Franklin, Franklin thought he should change sacred and undeniable to be, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That rang with Jefferson, so he changed that. And then every place in the Declaration of Independence, as we look at all of the pages, on the left page, it shows what Jefferson wrote in brown, or what the actual text was from the Declaration. On the right side, it shows historical background and reasoning and our modern interpretation. But on the bottom right, it shows which articles and section or bills of right safeguard this principle. Every line of the Declaration is protected by the Constitution of the United States. And one thing that's important, they did not talk about having a constitutional convention. It was the federal convention. It was the federal constitution. And so words mattered then. They didn't call it the Democratic Republic. It was because they saw the tyranny of democracy in France, and Madison did not want to replicate pure democracy. It was a confederation, or a league, a union between states, and he really wanted to make sure that each state held whatever they didn't give to the federal government. So this is what Jefferson wrote in the preamble. This is what he wrote 2 years earlier, and this is what everybody believes Jefferson borrowed and rearranged from Mason. Jefferson had already written these things. He didn't need to borrow anything from a document that came into his newspaper on June 12th, the day after he started writing. He didn't say, "Oh, now I know I need to write." No, he'd already written it. Wow. The long train of abuses. That's a John Locke phrase. So he borrowed that. And we don't even mind that he may have borrowed from everybody. He was trying to be the voice of an era here. So we break down the phrases. And then, let me ask you this. As we look at the Declaration of Independence, there's usually just a couple of grievances that people kind of think that the war was about that. Usually, the Tax Act, right? Taxation without representation was big. The Boston Tea Party, and people say this was a war over tea. What other big ones come to you, Roger, that are grievances? Is there anything that stands out bigger than those?
Let's see.
And as we do that, we're gonna go up to show you a list of some of the grievances. So there's 27 of them. These are just short titles for them. And each of these has a fun story, or amazing. Sometimes not so much fun. Trade, controlling our trade, taxation without deprived of trial by juries.
Yep.
And taking away our charters, dissolving Parliament. You're familiar with these things, right?
Sure, absolutely. And it's so tied with everything that's happening. Talk about trade and tariffs and things like that's happening right now.
Yes, it led to war here, and so we've got some interesting things that we could say, because I think. If tariffs should be used today, it should be used against the countries that have slaves today and allow real life slavery today to go on. Because there's $150 billion worth of profits going to slave masters today. And I'm talking about real slaves. And we know of 150 products that we're buying cheaper because they're made by slaves. We got to stop that. That's what tariffs should do, if anything. So let me show you how the books work together. So this is the adult book. And this is grievance number one. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. And then here's what Jefferson wrote about it 2 years before. I'll go over that in a second. Then historical background and constitutional safeguards. Well, we can look at that in the youth book as well. And it looks a lot the same. I keep Jefferson's words on the left. It's almost like scripture. You have to read the words, even though they're a little hard to understand. But then on the right for the youth book, we put it in youth verbiage and then what this means. So when one person can stop every good law, the people's voice disappears. The founders made sure our government would never work that way again. In America, leaders must listen and laws must serve the public good. Does that make sense?
That's great. It's great that you broke this down for the youth as well to be able to interpret.
And then, so in here, let me show you what he says in this one. So this is what Jefferson wrote 2 years earlier in the summary view of the rights of British America. It is now, therefore, the great office of His Majesty to resume the exercise of his negative power. Negative power. That means the king's veto. Okay. And he used that extensively. Negative. We have seen His Majesty practice on the laws of the American legislatures for the most trifling reasons, and sometimes for no conceivable reason at all. His Majesty has rejected laws of the most salutary tendency. And then we see what another historian wrote in 1877 and 1878. He explains all of the grievances. Benson John Lossing, and I have his original huge books on these. But how do we show this to the little kids? Because we could take one of these a day, and mom and dad, for the first time, understand the Declaration, and Bobby and Susie know it too, but little Sally, well, little Susie can read this to her. Pretend King George was a big old bear ruling us from an opulent cave across the sea. It was his duty to say yes or no to laws the people of America wanted to make. But sometimes the king would say no, even when the laws were really, really good and would help everyone. It puzzled the people because he would say no for the tiniest of reasons and sometimes for no reason at all. The people wanted the king to think carefully and to say yes to the laws that would make their land a safe and happy place. And we're the bunnies, and his soldiers and other guys are the foxes. And
that's awesome.
So that's what we're doing.
Great work.
Military is superior. So we're back now. Thank you. Back now to Forgotten Liberties, the adult version here. I'm going to just highlight what I consider to be just a few of the more important ones here. He suppresses representation. So when we lived, Connecticut was all the way over here too. They had to go all the way over here to court, and that was really hard. So we'll just go on to a few more. I'm going to go over to number 7. He controls the settlement of land and naturalization. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states. He only wanted British to come in. There were too many Germans coming over. So if you look at this map here, I'm going to bring that up big in a minute. But first, let's blow this up. We had a French and Indian War, right? And we were promised that our officers and men who fought would be able to have land over in the Ohio country mostly. This was already chartered to our colonies. Officers got 5,000 acres, captain, field officers, captain 3,000, all the way down to 50 acres for a private soldier. We fought for that war. We already owned the land that the French claimed after we had it. The French never settled it until they started building forts in around early 50s. So Jefferson said in his declaration about the necessity of taking up arms, the lands which were conquered during the French and Indian War by joint arms of us and Great Britain are declared to be their conquest and subject to their disposal. The king grabbed, he took France's claim as spoils of war away from the colonies. So you see this map here on the left?
Mhm.
Massachusetts had Maine as well, right? But also all across Western New York and all the way across into through across Wisconsin, here at Michigan and Wisconsin. Connecticut had a lot of Ohio and then all the way over to Illinois and all the way to the Mississippi. Look at North Carolina.
Wow.
Virginia claimed,
Huge.
so Pennsylvania, you see, was just over to the Ohio, almost to the Ohio River. Virginia claimed Western Ohio. Also, this was disputed here, and they claimed all the way to Canada. And their charter took them to the South Sea, the Pacific Ocean. After the French and Indian War, the king drew this line. Everybody thinks it's to protect the Native Americans from us going in, but he claimed that land and built forts along here to keep us out. Now, they had already sold 200,000 acres and chartered to Washington and Mason and Governor Dinwiddie, and it was Washington's older brothers initially, in Ohio, and gave them charters that they had purchased. But they knew they still had to buy the land from the Indians. I'll show you that in a bit. Okay. So let's go back smaller here to another one that kind of goes with it. So there are stories about all of these things. Military, superior subjects us to foreign jurisdiction, quartering of troops. And you know what? The Parliament in England knew better because they had a Declaration of Right in around 1626 or so, where they complained to King Charles I about quartering of troops without their authority. And then also in the Declaration of Rights in 1689, they complained again about the quartering of troops from the king on them without their authority. And then they turn around and do it to us. They knew better. Well, sorry. So here is a very small sentence. One of the grievances for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. That doesn't say a lot, does it? But the people who were living there then, they knew what Jefferson meant, right? For example, I think I described a little bit, but we could only trade with England. England made that law. We didn't agree. They doubled and trebled, meaning tripled what they sold us. But we could only buy exclusively from them of what better commodities of the same kind would cost us elsewhere. They tripled the prices, and at the same time gave us much less for what we carry thither that might be had at more convenient ports. Britain had us over a barrel. They could make the iron, we couldn't. They could make hats from our beaver, we couldn't, or we would be fined and imprisoned. And so people think that taxation without representation and the Tea Act, which led to the Boston Tea Party, were the big things. They were so small, but they were because it was only 2% tax on tea, and it was less expensive tea than we could get other places, even with the tax. It wasn't the amount, it was the principle. And that's the straw that broke the camel's back. But these other things were about land. And so when we get to grievance number 20, are you familiar with this one? He talks about enlarging the borders of a nearby province.
No.
That's okay. And so it's not taught. And most people aren't aware of that. That's where the Quebec Act of 1774, where he made Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota part of Quebec. Not just keeping us away from there, and then he was starting laws and selling off land and all kinds of stuff. Well, Jefferson and the rest knew that. That was bad. That's land. That's a lot more than tea. That's 2/3 of what the size of our colonies were. So in 17 84, we were trying to settle the Revolutionary War, right? With the Treaty of Paris. The French minister Vergennes proposed this map. They had helped us win the war, but they didn't want us to get too big for our britches and become maybe more mighty than the nations of Europe. So we had to stay as the United States on the east side of the Appalachian Mountains. This he labeled now not Quebec, but now as Canada. This is Britain. This yellow part here that he had was to be controlled by Spain, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee. So our representatives there, Adams, Franklin, and John Jay, said no to the French. They dealt directly with the British, who recognized our independence and placed our western boundary, the Mississippi River, that tripled the size of our nation.
Wow.
That's a little bit more than a 2% tax on tea, isn't it?
That's for sure.
So as we learn these things, there's just so much that is hidden from us. Now I'm going to go back to what I consider to be perhaps the most important. Well, let's share this one first before I go there. This is a grievance in the Declaration. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. So I've seen where there are people who are interpreters acting, they're dressed as in the colonial period, and then they say, isn't that terrible? But they don't know what happened. Oh my, there's a huge story here, where on early October, 1775, after the Battle of or after the Boston Tea Party, the general in Boston sent Captain Mowat up to start bombarding and burning towns. Well, he'd already had trouble up at Falmouth, Massachusetts, so he bombarded that city. They burned down 400 buildings. This is middle of October, just before winter is setting in. Falmouth, Massachusetts is Portland, Maine today.
Yes.
Okay. Charlestown, they burned. Bristol, Rhode Island, they bombarded and they burned churches and other buildings and homes. Now, Governor Dunmore down in Virginia, January 1st, 1776. Now, this is all before the Declaration, right?
Mm-hmm.
And after Lexington and Concord, which was in April. And Bunker Hill was what, June 17th. So you kind of see the timing here, right? Norfolk, January 1st, Governor Dinwiddie bombarded and burned Norfolk, Virginia. 900 buildings were burned down. But we can't blame the British for all of them, because some of the patriots, when they saw it all burning, they decided to add to the conflagration by burning down some of the Tory merchants who dealt with the British that they didn't like. So it wasn't all the British, but they started it. And so as we're looking at this, we come to the one that was taken out of the Declaration of Independence. The slavery clause, this Christian king of Great Britain. Did I talk about this a little bit earlier? I think I shared a little bit of that.
Maybe a little bit,
okay.
Yes.
But this is where we can see it. This is the rough draft of the Declaration of Independence. So we're told, we read in the preamble, we hold these truths that all men are created equal. And if you ask people today, they'll say, yeah, white men, they forgot the slaves and they forgot the women. Men was a generic term, but he got specific here. The king, this Christian, underlined, king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men, big M-E-N, should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative, so for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. And he called this an assemblage of horrors. So this is the whole writing of that clause right here. And this is what Jefferson wrote 2 years prior in the Summary View of the Rights of British America. The abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. But before we can free them, or before the enfranchisement of slaves it is necessary to exclude all further importations from Africa. And then he goes on to talk about these people who had never offended anyone being stolen, many thousands dying on their way thither.
Hmm.
And this is so shameful an abuse of power, trusted with His Majesty for other purposes, if not reformed, would call for some legal restriction.
Wow. So this never made it because no one else wanted this to
Yep.
go through.
11 said yes.
11 said yes.
11. Georgia and South Carolina would not sign it unless it was removed.
And it had to be unanimous.
It had to be unanimous. We had no chance to win that war anyway. We had a zero chance. But without South Carolina and Georgia, it was over. So they had to compromise, and this was struck out by Congress. They deliberated this just one day, about July 1st, and they struck it. And Jefferson said that Congress mangled it. But he also said that some of our northern brethren were complicit in this as well. Those were the slave traders from Rhode Island.
Mm.
Now, Jefferson, in his I'll show you something in a minute I think you'll enjoy. But in 1783, he wanted to amend the Virginia Constitution to say, nor to permit the introduction of any more slaves to reside in this state, or the continuance of slavery itself beyond the generation which shall be living on the 31st day of December, 1800, all persons born after that day being hereby declared free. Some people say, because others believed it, that Jefferson wanted to increase the value of his slaves by reducing the supply, by not allowing more to come in. No, he wrote against this many, many times. And he knew that the king had prostituted his slavery. Remember, that was wasn't that term he used?
Yep.
We prove it. Nobody knows this. A friend of mine, Patrick McFadden in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, now has secured a document that showed how he did. This was, he shared an office with his mentor and partner, George Wythe. And Wythe signed this document where the king sold the exclusive right to collect duty or taxes, on liquor and slaves coming into Virginia to these men, to be that sum of 100,000 pounds to be paid to the king, his heirs, and successors for duties on liquor and slaves imported into that colony. So the king was making money. Don't forget, they brought 2.6 million slaves across the Atlantic from Africa. America, after our declaration, brought 63,927, and we're blamed for all of it.
Wow.
Now, look what Franklin wrote about that. He put this in one of his newspapers as a satire first, but then he said, several laws heretofore made in our colonies to discourage the importations of slaves by laying a heavy duty, that's what we wanted to do, to make them too expensive to be brought, have been disapproved and repealed by your government. We know of at least 7 times that they tried to stop the slaves from coming by making them too expensive and to passing legislation. So even in the Declaration, we still wanted to have the olive branch, that in peace we can still be friends. And what happened to the signers of the Declaration we get into. But right here, these are the grievances. Remember, this is 2/3 of the Declaration of Independence. This is what Jefferson wrote in that document I shared with you earlier from the preamble to the Virginia Constitution, by putting his negative on the laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. In his rough draft, he has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He changed none of the meaning, but a little bit of the words, and many of the words are exactly the same until where we get to subjects and citizens, where he wiped it out.
Right.
And we showed you how that there was that smudge under the word citizens. While it was wet, he wiped it out. And we now today know, because of the Library of Congress, the word subjects was beneath that. Virginia Constitution. Guess what? This is what Jefferson wrote in May, in early June, before he wrote the Declaration. In Virginia, no person hereafter coming into this country shall be held in slavery under any pretext, whatever. How about women? Equality of inheritance. Descendants shall go, the laws of gavel kind, but females shall have equal rights with males in inheritance. All persons shall have free liberty and religious opinion. No quartering of troops. And this is really, really important. And I wish more of the founders would have understood this. No lands shall be appropriated until purchased of the Indian native proprietors, nor shall any purchases be made of them but on behalf of the public by authority of the acts of the General Assembly. Nobody can go out and just take Indian lands if this would have been put, and they would have had to been fairly purchased according to Jefferson.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people say he didn't really believe that. Well, he wrote it. And the right to bear arms. 7 more grievances were added, and Jefferson already had the information for them. So that's what was in the final. The Committee of 5 presented it to General Congress on July 28th, but they tabled it because they were still talking about, are we really going to declare ourselves free? And then it was debated, and that's where Jefferson said they mangled it. Then the final marked up fair copy was delivered to John Dunlap and printed. And after he printed it, he threw it away. We don't have anything from between Jefferson's rough draft and this fair copy that Congress marked up and made changes to. So a lot of assumptions have been made, and that's where historians get into trouble. You don't make assumptions without declaring it as an assumption.
Right.
That's part of what answers the question you asked earlier.
Sure.
Jefferson called it's a wolf by the ears. We discussed Sally Hemings. We don't hide from the ugly. You don't sweep it under the rug. You share the truth.
Yes.
Then in the afterword, I share, this has to be shared with moms and dads and teachers, because some of the stuff about slavery is hard. And I was going to leave it out, but people said, no, our kids are taught that we are the guilty parties in this. And there is a lot of guilt, but we have to understand. So I tried to present it gently as I could. The first slaves that came to the United States of America didn't come in 1619. They came in 1526, 100 of them, with a group from Hispaniola, a leader named de Ion. And the Spanish maps of that period show Terra de Ion being for the Southeast United States. He brought about 650 on a couple of ships, along with 100 African slaves to Georgetown, South Carolina area. And then they may have gone down toward northern Georgia. They had kidnapped a group of Indians from that same South Carolina area a few years earlier. Took them to Hispaniola, and they took at least one of them to Spain, and he told all kinds of really neat stories. So they brought him back, and they tried to settle, and he ran away. And so we talk about this, the first African slaves in mainland North America. And but the first kids from England, before any Africans were brought to Jamestown, England had swept up the kids off the streets of England that were homeless or whatever, but a lot of them weren't. street urchins. And they put them in Bridewell Prison, in a former palace kind of thing, for about a year. And then they put them on board the two ships, the Duty and Jonathan, and they called them Duty Boys. 140 kids from 8 to 16 years old, 40% of them were young girls. They were to send them to Jamestown to learn a trade as indentured servants. Now, these kids were not old enough to sign a document of indenture, so it was illegal. They got to Jamestown, and then they sent for more. It was a good deal. They only had to pay £5 a piece for these kids. After 3 years, of the first 300 kids brought to Jamestown, only 12 remained alive.
Oh,
One of the girls who survived was found a couple of years later, bleeding to death. She had received 500 whips for running away once too often. During the term of indenture, they are slaves. The difference is African slavery, the chattel slavery, meant they and their children were enslaved with no chance for freedom for most. Some were able to secure their freedom. So here we see the timeline. The first African slaves, 1526. The first indentured servants from England came. They weren't indentured, they were slaves. And 4 months later, in August, the first 20. And John Rolfe recorded in his diary that they were traded for victuals. So Jamestown did not send for those slaves. The ship White Lion was off the coast at Point Comfort, needed food. They traded food for those slaves. And those were the first African slaves that stayed. Now, the first Africans actually stayed from the Spanish settlement as well, down in northern Georgia, South Carolina, because De Ion died just a couple months after landing, and then there was mutiny. The slaves put down the mutiny, and they burned the cabin of the head mutineer. And then 150 or so that survived, they went back to Hispaniola, except for the Africans. They stayed with the Native Americans, and we probably have their descendants with us today. People have seen this. I'm not going to get into it, but the slave ship Brooks is what inspired Wilberforce, along with the ship Zong. That's a horrible story I won't get into right now, but almost 150 slaves thrown overboard, and then they claimed insurance for lost cargo. These people couldn't even sit up between bunks. They were so narrow. And then we get into the slave trade, and there's so much. Then you see the Congo Free State over here. Roger, are you familiar with that?
no.
Well, a lot of people say it would have been better for most of the Africans to stay in Africa, but the Europeans didn't leave them alone, even there. 1885 Berlin Conference. Us good Europeans split up Africa and gave all of Africa to different European countries, except for Congo, the 10th largest nation in the world. They gave it as the personal kingdom of King Leopold, because he told that conference that he was going to teach these natives. He was working with Dr. Livingston down there, and they were going to teach them the consequence of sin and raise their standard of living. Well, you know what he did? He turned 35 million people into slaves, and they had to get all of the gold and ivory they could. And then a gentleman named John Dunlop invented the pneumatic tire that could be blown up, this man from Scotland. And the demand for rubber just escalated throughout the world. Congo didn't have rubber trees. It had rubber vines that proliferated throughout the land. This entire population had to collect as much rubber as possible. He had an 18,000-man force publique, a police force that was military. And their white leaders made them get as much rubber as they could from every village all throughout the country. And if a village didn't produce enough rubber, these men had to cut off the hands of their kids
Oh,
and turn in baskets after baskets of thousands of hands to these white officers. Over 10 million of them died. And we have never heard of this. My son told me a little about it. I had to research it. Why are we not told about these atrocities?
awful, awful.
So I can't say much about. I don't even mention this in lectures that I give. It's too hard.
Yeah.
Here we see maps that a lot of people have seen, but I drew this one and look at this. This is the United States, the red one. But it's important not to know just where they landed, but from where they came. Even people who don't know today where their ancestors came, by DNA, they can find out where they came from, geographically. And we can see the numbers that were brought from West Central Africa and the numbers that died. The numbers that died crossing the Atlantic Ocean from each of these areas. And I never want to ever hear anybody saying, but some of them were treated benevolently once they received, by some masters. That doesn't work.
No. Wow.
Here's the entire slave trade. The numbers that I received from slavevoyages.org, a tremendous organization that's doing this research around the globe. 364 years of slave trade. Every one of these points represents a special, loving child of God. They're all important, but we're myopic, and we blame the United States. This right here, 20 years that we allowed it. Here's the United States, 63,927. 14,000 died coming here. That's too many. But that doesn't compare to 750,000 died going to Brazil by the Portuguese.
Wow.
So here we are. Look, a lot of the little islands in the Caribbean had more slaves brought to those islands because they kept dying and they had to send more, kept dying. And here we are, and we're blamed for it all. Here's the slavevoyages.org, and they've given me permission to use their numbers. 1788 to 1808, under our flag. England still continued to bring them in as well. This shows where they came. The bigger bubble, the bigger the number of people, and the Caribbean. It's not a good story. And then after the English freed theirs in the Caribbean, 1834, 35, something like that, they started bringing indentured servants, millions, I don't remember how many, from India to be indentured servants. And again, during the term of their indenture, they were slaves. Now, I put this in, Roger, because most people think that the 3/5 compromise was really a bad thing. Are you pretty familiar with this?
I'm not.
Okay. In the Constitution, as we were coming together, there were large states that had representatives more than small states. That's how I was taught it. But it was more a conflict about North and South. Now, at the time, all states except for Massachusetts still had slaves, all states. So you can see here, Massachusetts in the north had 0 by that time. Pennsylvania, 3,707. New York, 21,000.
Wow.
This is a 1790 census. So I had to go to the census to find this information. And I broke it down by north and south. So there were still 40,000 slaves in the north, but 654,000 slaves in the south. Now, the South wanted to count all of their slaves for apportionment. That means how many representatives in Congress they would have from each state, because there was more population in the South than the North, right? Total population.
Yep.
The South wanted to count them all, like pretending their slaves were their constituents. Right. There would have been 38 representatives in the South and 36 total in the North. What would that have done?
Oof.
Their agenda.
Yep. That's
Would
right.
have trumped everything.
Yep.
That would have been bad for the slaves, right?
Yep.
So the North said, no, you can't count any of them because they're property. We should tax you for them rather than
Right.
let you count them for reps. And the South said no, because that would have been 36-25. Too big a
Okay.
disparity. There would not have been a union. So people blame the North for this. They say they shouldn't have allowed it. Well, then what would we have been able to help South Carolina get over slavery if that wasn't part of us?
Right.
So Wilson from Pennsylvania proposed the compromise. That's what this is. That you can count 60% of your slaves toward apportionment, and we will also only charge you 60% of federal taxes on that 60% number for slaves and Indians not taxed.
Hmm.
It was genius.
It
That
was.
was a carrot and a stick. Okay.
Wow. Yep.
35 north, 30
30.
south. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? We couldn't stop slavery at the time. There would not have been a nation.
But it was the best possible.
Jefferson,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So you do what you can.
Yep.
And then there's the 20-year compromise that said that Congress could not address slavery for 20 years or the importation of slaves. And so we were under the Articles of Confederation. We couldn't do away with slavery then because it was a weak confederation. It had no power to raise taxes or to regulate trade, so it couldn't address the slave trade. This shows a little bit of slavery being imported. Dots, the red dot, that's England. The blue is us. Now, then we signed our Constitution, and we can't address the importation of slaves for 20 years. Okay, we can't pass a federal law stopping the importation of. It didn't say slaves in the Constitution. It says any persons that any state wants to import, to allow to immigrate. It meant slaves, and so this represents the numbers coming from England and the United States into mainland North America, our states. Now, all states by this time. Before 1807 had outlawed the importation of slaves independently, not as a federal, but independently. That wasn't against the Constitution. And then South Carolina reintroduced it. And then they see 4 years prior to 1808, they go, hey, Congress, it's not automatic that it's going to stop. Congress can't address it. And stop it federally until 1808. Congress has to still vote, okay? But they were saying that because all the other states were already outlawing it, they imported as many as they could for the 4 years prior to. See this upswing here?
Wow.
1,026, 5,000, 6,000, 1806, 9,000, 1807, the last year, and 25,000 into South Carolina in 1 year.
Wow.
And then Jefferson on December 2nd, 1806, as president, sent to Congress that State of the Union letter. I congratulate you, fellow citizens, on the approach of the period at which you may interpose your authority constitutionally to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights, which have been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa. Wow. That's his language from 30 years before in the rough draft of the Declaration of Independence.
Amazing.
And so on March 2nd, 1807, Congress passed the law to outlaw the importation of slaves in the United States of America, being made effective January 1st, 1808. Nothing had to happen on that date. Congress did it then. England, given credit for being the first to ban the importation of slaves, passed their legislation March 25th, 1807. Who beat them by 3 weeks?
That's right. Wow.
And it's not taught. But we're not without guilt. New England brought slaves, 100,000 or so, a lot of them to the Caribbean. They traded 11, this is New England merchants, traded 11 million gallons of rum for African slaves. 110 gallons for a man, 130 for a man, 110 for a woman, 80 gallons of rum for an African child. Major universities, Yale, Brown. The second largest slave trading family, slave merchant family, was the Browns,
Hmm.
Brown University. Um, this is a picture of one of the ships, Sanderson, bringing rum to Africa
Hmm.
and trading and African iron, and then trading it for 56 slaves. They came here. They brought a couple to New England. So this is the 1688 Germantown Petition against slavery that I told you about. What are some of the things they talk about? Would you want to be enslaved? Pennsylvania was built on freedom and they took people's freedom away. People in Europe won't want to come to a place where people are treated like cattle. And just because someone's darker skin doesn't mean they should be enslaved. Slaveholders broke families apart, forcing men and women into, dang it should have been adultery. I made a mistake here. Whoa, our next edition will fix that.
That's right.
You're buying stolen goods, stolen property. And he said, what if these people gather together and fight for their freedom? Will you take up the sword to put them back into slavery? So we had 210,000 blacks fought for the Union. And lots of them, 68,000 casualties of black forces. 26 of them won the Medal of Honor.
Wow.
Received, they earned, they didn't win it. But total of all wars, all but the Civil War, more death. This is death. This is to free those slaves. But there were some amazing heroes. The Code Talkers, wonderful heroes, World War I and World War II, and they came back to a country that didn't respect them. Here was a colonel during the Revolutionary War, Colonel George Middleton. His group was the Bucks of America. John Hancock gave him a beautiful silk flag at the end of the war with that they have up there today. Now, it's interesting. During the Battle of Bunker Hill, he brought 103 blacks and Native Americans who fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Prince Hall, Salem Poor, Peter Salem, Caesar Brown, Grant Cooper. 2 of these were killed in battle. And the real hero, Peter Salem. He had British Major Pitcairn had rallied the British and got them, after being forced back, rallied them, and they were coming again. And a black soldier, Peter Salem, who was here with George Middleton, killed Major Pitcairn, gave them a chance to withdraw. That's where General Warren, Dr. Warren, was up on the hill at that time and was killed. So I tell about John Howland and the Mayflower because our first Constitution really was the Mayflower. You know, that's a lot old, not as old as the Iroquois Mayflower, but the Mayflower Compact. This boy who fell off the Mayflower, he was the clerk, the scribe of the first governor, Governor Carver. He was knocked off in an Atlantic storm in the fall, late fall, and a broken halyard, a rope, was by his head. So he kept out of the water, gulping for air. That rope was there. A miracle. They pulled him in. He now has 10 million descendants. He signed as an indentured servant the Mayflower Compact. And he probably wrote it, is what they say, because he was the scribe of the governor. And he has a large group of descendants. Now, what's interesting, he, along with Governor Bradford and 2 other men, they took on the entire debt of the Mayflower, of Plymouth Plantation to pay off the London merchants in exchange for the Indian fur patent. And so he went up the Kennebunk River for 25 years and had a trading post up there. They traded with the Native Americans for pelts, and they paid off the entire debt to the colony. But one time, a guy from just north of Boston went up there and tied his boat up next to theirs and tried to hone in on it. And they tried to cut his rope, and he threatened with a gun. And Howland yelled at him from shore, says, "If you're going to point that gun at anybody, point it at me. Those are my men." But he went ahead and shot one of the men anyway and killed him.
Hmm.
And then one of the other men shot him, and that caused a lot of problems. But um, he actually had saved the life of the leaders of the Native Americans that we all talk about, that they had the first uh, Thanksgiving with. And his home, he and his wife Elizabeth had 10 children, and their home that they lived with their son in their later years is the last remaining Pilgrim home. And he is my 10th great grandfather. Um, Benjamin lay an amazing, there's just so much to learn of things that are hidden. There were daughters of liberty, not just sons of liberty. Sarah Bradley Fulton was the one who dressed up all the guys as Indians and then had her come to her home to take their headdresses and clean up their faces afterward. And she and other daughters of liberty acted as nurses at Bunker Hill. And then she one time she and her husband had brought in loads of firewood, and she was guiding these oxen through to the American lines, and the British grabbed the oxen. They were going to take them away. She grabbed them and then took them back, and she got through the lines anyway. And she took secret messages from Washington through the lines to the troop. Mercy Otis Warren, a great publisher, involved with the committees of correspondence, people that we need to learn about. She wrote a history on the revolution, and I've got that history. It's hard to read. Oh, she was a good writer, though. Benjamin Banneker, perhaps the most bright mind of all the United States in the early 1790s. He was a mathematician, an astronomer. He wrote an almanac. And when Jefferson received his almanac, he was so impressed. But that almanac came to Jefferson along with a letter where he castigated Jefferson for Jefferson having written that he thought that blacks were inferior. An incredible letter. Jefferson wrote back and pretty much apologized. He recognized its conditions, not inherent, race that was the cause. And he is the man that saved Washington, D.C. He was a surveyor with Toussaint, not Toussaint, Louverture. I forget the guy's name. I'm just going too fast here. He left as he was surveying the city of Washington and took all the plans. Banneker had all the plans in his mind and reconstructed all of the survey. And he's the one who set the starting point with astronomy in the first place. And he even corrected an astronomy book I think, from France, where they had a mathematical error. And he sent the error to them, and they fixed the book. So we have heroes that we need to remember. And the other man that I quote in almost all of the books, all of the grievances, is Benson J. Lossing. I wrote away for all three of his books, or three of his books, and they were all signed with the beautiful script from F.E. Watkins, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. A tremendous voice for justice and abolition and women's rights before the Civil War. And then she went throughout the South teaching people after the Civil War. And then it was a school teacher in Philadelphia at a vocational school, wrote novel. And it's pretty well done. And her poetry is sublime. And then I want to end with this one. Native Americans. Have you heard of Polly Cooper?
No.
She was an Oneida Indian. Father was white, I think British, but she lived as an Oneida up in upstate New York. So after the Battle of Germantown, and Washington had taken the troops into a terrible winter of Valley Forge, our Congress was down in York, Pennsylvania, because the British were in Philadelphia. So a group of congressmen came up and spoke to Lafayette, General Lafayette. They commissioned him to go to northern New York, to Albany, to take control of an army and attack Quebec. He gets up there. You can't do that in the middle of the winter. We failed before. The army never really materialized. So he stopped at the Oneida encampment. These Oneida that were there, they had been heroes at the Battle of Oriskany over by Rome, New York, and also at Saratoga. Some great stories that we can tell another time. And he invited them to come down to Valley Forge with him. Two of the sons of the great chief Shenandoah came, along with Polly Cooper and 47 warriors, and they brought 600 baskets of corn. And Polly Cooper had to teach them, and she stayed there and cooked it because it was the very terribly rough white husk on the corn. It had to be, and then she would mix it with nuts and berries, and even with the husks itself to give more nutrition. Martha Washington presented her with a shawl and a bonnet, and the Oneida still have that black shawl today to commemorate Polly Cooper. She saved our army. And then shortly after, as they're beginning to get well, Washington sent Lafayette across the Schuylkill River to scout out the disposition of the British north of Philadelphia. This is shortly a few weeks before England left Philadelphia. And he took a 2,200-man force with him, an army, from Valley Forge to cross the river to Barren Hill, Barren. There were 16,000 British there. They didn't know that at the time. As they camped that night, there were 7,000 of the British flanking them and straight on, ready to attack. And the British general in Philadelphia had made plans to have Lafayette for dinner the next night after he had destroyed his army. The Iroquois Indians, the Oneidas, they warned Lafayette, and he was able to take his entire army down the defile, the depression, and cross the Schuylkill River to safety, while some of the French and these 47 Oneida braves fought rearguard action. 6 of those braves were killed, saving our army. They're buried at White Marsh Cemetery with honors. Barren Hill, Barren, is Lafayette Hill today, in remembrance of Lafayette in this action. Before it was Barren Hill, it was called Farmers Town, Farmar. A major farmer had purchased a manor, that's over 1,000 acres, a manor, from William Penn in around 1690 or so. He fell ill and couldn't come. I think he was in Ireland. He died, but his wife and children came north of Philadelphia, just north of Germantown, and they settled. And then she died a few years later. And then she began selling off, her son began selling off the properties. Heinrich Castleberry, the first of my ancestors from Germany, became Henry Castleberry as he was naturalized by William Penn in 1691, along with these other men that had written that petition, and Rittenhousens and other famous Pennsylvanians that were German. He now could purchase land, and he bought a farm. That farm was at Farmers Town, which became Barren Hill, which is now Lafayette Hill today, where this action was fought, where these Native Americans saved our country.
Charles, thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations on putting all this together, all this hard work. We're grateful to be part of it as the publisher, and thank you so much for coming on.
I'm thankful for you and your team. It's more than people can realize. I don't think publishers generally offer what your team does. And I honor you and them for the efforts that they make. What I've done is not perfect, as you know. And it's just a start. And there's a lot more to go. Thank you.
Charles Castleberry, thank you so much. Welcome to the American Real family.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to American Real. For more stories like this one, be sure to stop by AmericanReal.tv. Follow us on all social media to stay up to date with everything American Real. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and contact one of our publishing experts if you're ready to publish your book and become a best-selling author.